Mute myself.
Okay, so can you see my screen?
Okay.
Yes, so can you guys see my screen? Just let me know.
Yes, yes, I can see it.
Okay, excellent. So thank you all for joining this evening. Will be a continuation of the focus on developing your advocacy strategy. Are there any questions from the session on Tuesday?
No questions for me. It was pretty clear.
Okay. So what we'll actually start doing for this session, and we will most likely, because it is a lot of content, and since your presentation is based on you developing your advocacy strategy, we'll use the session next week that is assigned as a tutorial. You may need to finish up this particular segment, this session on advocacy strategy then as well. But we'll start to go through the steps that you will go through in terms of developing an advocacy strategy. It's not, even though I think in the course content it said 9 steps, and I think in the presentation I probably have 10 steps, and in some cases some people will say 8 steps. It's very fluid, but the basic steps, we're going to cover the basic steps of what you will need to consider in terms of developing that advocacy strategy. On Tuesday's session, we covered a lot of what it would, in terms of getting the organization itself prepared to undertake and implement, develop and implement an advocacy strategy. So, as I said, we're just going to go through some of those basic steps. So the first step is developing your advocacy priorities, and that was actually one of the first worksheets that we had given you to complete, because it is important to be able to identify what policy-related problems and needs that the organization, that your CSO will be addressing. So what is the main issues? What are the problems? What are the underlying causes of those problems, and how do you actually go about doing it? So for example, you might identify that a particular policy may be absent, it may be ineffective, or it may not be enforced. And that may be the focus of your advocacy strategy, because you want to have it either implemented, you want the enforcement procedures to be actually activated. And so the whole process will be centered around that that particular problem. But you're developing your advocacy strategy is, you're not only focused on the problem, you need to be also to come up with the solution. So it's much more than just identifying the problem and raising awareness about the problem. You actually need to take the steps to identify how you are actually going to address that problem. So one of the first things that you need to do is to, what we say, undertake a situation analysis, where you try to understand the situation by identifying the issues around which you would design your advocacy strategy. So I don't know if anyone want to give me an example of how you have, in terms of the first worksheet, how you've gone about identifying the problems and identifying the priorities, your advocacy priorities. And then, we'll just work from there in terms of you just giving some examples of what you've come up with and specific to your CSO. And this is specific to worksheet 1, which, you know, by now you should have completed, and hopefully within the next week, upload for us facilitators to take a look at. Anyone in particular want to go on this one?
Hey, sorry, I missed the first part of the question. So before jumping on it, I just want to make sure that you ask the right thing. Are you asking if we can identify one of the problems that we came up with in our CSO? Is that what you asked?
Yes, I was thinking in terms of the first worksheet. So, you know, you were supposed to identify problems and then come up with your advocacy priorities.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so I just wanted to have an idea of you know, just what you, just one person, just what you've done so far in terms of identifying those problems and coming up with the priorities.
Okay.
No?
Give me a second. I'm still here. I think others are
Oh,
still
I'll ask the question a bit later then.
Okay.
It's probably a little bit early to get in the flow of things. So I'll just continue. So
Yeah.
as I said, the first thing is to identify the situation about that particular issue that you're having. So the question to ask yourself is what are your advocacy priorities? So this requires that you work with all stakeholders, and that's why we said it's even though you may have more than one person in a particular CSO taking the course, it's not an individual activity. You have to come together and identify what it is that you're looking to address. What is the problem? What is the issue? What are the problems surrounding it? And what are some of the solutions you can come up with? So it requires all stakeholder engagement, so including your team in the CSO itself. And if I know some of the CSOs only have, you know, in some cases, the majority of the work depends on one person. And in which case, you know, you can probably get together with some people who are working in the area and just, you know, work with them to try to identify what some of those issues are. So definitely the organization, your team, your target group. So you're identifying an issue for those people who are likely to be affected. The decision makers, the person who you want to target, your potential partners as well. So you need to be very, very inclusive when you are coming up with your advocacy priorities. Again, this is identifying what the issue is, coming up with several of the problems, and then identifying those ones that you believe your CSO is best suited to tackle.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a focus on specific problems, the root causes of those problems, the barriers identified that you can identify to solving them, and then any policy related solutions that you can come up with, or any other solutions that you can come up with to address those problems. So you'll come up with more than one, and that's why we said then you prioritize the ones based on this particular circumstance of the CSO. So again, I'll remind you of the problem solution tree approach that you would have taken in worksheet 1. So that approach was, you have to go through developing a problem and the solution tree, planning your research, and what that really means is a lot of what you do when you're developing your strategy has to be evidence-based. So you have to go out with collecting data, you need to be analyzing the data, coming up with information, you know, researching the background, you know, literature reviews, primary data, you know, your surveys that you're going to conduct, secondary information, focus group meetings, case studies, academic reports, all that stuff will be part and parcel of you being able to really identify the problem. And that is because sometimes what happens is that we assume, we see something, a situation, and we assume that that is the problem. But by doing research, you might either find out that someone else is tackling that particular problem. So you may need to approach the situation from a different angle. That's why you come up with more than one problem. But it also gives you, going through that research also gives you a very good idea of who your stakeholder base is likely to be, as well as the decision makers that you would like to approach, the influencers. So that is very, very important in terms of building that foundation for networking, which we will get to as we go on. So, and then it's about generating that evidence base, because you need to back your arguments up with data, with figures. You know, how many women, how many children, you know, is it a particular community? What is happening? You know, try to back it up with evidence. And then you go about then deciding from all the problems that you've identified, then it is not everything that you can tackle in terms of your CSO, in terms of the competency of the CSO, or that you might want to tackle at once. You might decide, well, okay, we can very well, you know, tackle 3 of these problems that we've identified, but this is the most urgent one. Or in order to be successful in implementing, you know, a particular a solution to a particular problem, we may need to tackle something else before. So that's why you do need to have a lot of discussion, more than one person, you know, brainstorming, putting their minds to coming up with the problems and the solution, and also prioritizing those. So basically, the take-home message there, it is not a one-man show. Even though there may be one person carrying the weight of the particular CSO at any point in time, just try to find some other people that you can work with. At the very least, the people who you've identified who may be your targets, try to engage them as early as possible. So what this does is it allows you to have a thorough understanding of the problems, the issues, and the solutions. And that's really what you want, because that then allows you to get the kind of information, get the kind of support that you need to move to actually implement the strategy. So the situation analysis then is the first step in identifying your particular areas of action. It does form the foundation for your advocacy, your entire advocacy plan, because like I said, it does generate a great body of knowledge that you can use to move your cause forward. And what it also does is it provides, if there isn't a baseline that you can measure against at some point in time in the future, it does provide that baseline as well, for which you can then measure your progress. And that will be critical when we get to the section, possibly next week, where we talk about monitoring and evaluation. So one of the tools that you can use, and this is one that we introduced in worksheet 1, is using the problem and solution tree. Excuse me. What this does, it offers a very visual structure for which you can start to analyze, to take a look at the problem, analyze the situation, and come up with solution. So the problem tree usually helps you to understand the immediate and underlying causes of a particular issue. If you are, and you need to be very, very thorough in this process, and that's why we'll spend the time actually just taking a look at the problem tree and working through an example. The solution tree then, once you've identified what the problems are, what the root causes of the problems are, the solution tree is where you actually start to come up with the solutions that can effect a change. So this is one depiction of the problem tree. So you usually tend to start with the problem, which is the effect or the symptoms that you tend to see. So what is the problem? Then you need to think in terms of what are the causes of that problem, and this tends to be a little bit more difficult to really get to. Whereas, for example, the effects are probably more clear because you can see there, you either have problems with sanitation, you have problems with HIV, you have problems with domestic abuse. You can see those effects, but what really are the root causes of that? You also need to be able to identify those. So once you have, so before we get there, if we take an example, so let me just go back up to the problem tree. So we start with a problem, and this is really in the depiction, this is where the tree or the trunk of the tree, that's the problem. This is, in this case, you're kind of asking questions like who, what, where, when. An example, for example, is if we take access to essential medicines. In this case, it can be to, something like polio, it can be HIV medicines or any other essential medicines. In Barbados, it could be diabetic medication, for example. So it may be a case where the essential medicine might be limited because the cost may be too high. So you've identified that as a problem. But then you need to ask yourself, well, what's the cause of this? So this is where you really have to ask yourself why. And once you it's almost like when you're skinning an onion. So you ask yourself why, that's the first layer, and you get an answer, but you keep asking the why until you get down to the core of the onion. Probably not a very good analogy, but you get I'm sure you'll get the meaning. You just start peeling away by asking why, so you get to that root cause of the problem. So in our example, with essential medicines, a root cause may be, and remember we identified a problem may be that the cost of the medication is too high. And you might say, well, that may be because there are no generic equivalents available for the affected stakeholders to have access to. So what's the cause of that? It may just be that, the pharmaceutical companies, in order to have, to maintain their profit line, they have lobbied legislation, they've had an impact on legislation which allows them to limit the amount of generic drugs that are being produced. There's several reasons for that, hinging on intellectual property, which we're not going to go to, but let's assume that they've been able to successfully lobby government to influence government to have something in place to restrict the use or the importation of generic drugs. And that is because they want to maintain their profit margin. And so that drives the price up. And remember that this is just an example that we're working through. So that's a root cause. And there may be several root causes to the problem, but we're just going to work through one particular example. But you have to go through this kind of thought process for all of the problems that you come up with. So the branches then of the problem tree is what you might consider the barriers. So these could be several barriers that would affect the, being able to have cheaper drugs being available. And then the leaves of the problem of the tree is what we call the solutions. So again, this is how an example of a solution might be that the government must include access to essential medicines for everyone as part of a national policy. And that can be backed by legislation. So you see how you need to be able to really work your way through the problem, the causes, and the effects, and come up with your solutions. And then the solution that you come up with, then you need to coach that in the form of your whole advocacy strategy then is to support that being, that decision on that policy being put in place. So once you have basically completed the situation analysis, you need to isolate the cases that you're going to address in your policy strategy, in the policy response. And as you see, problems can be quite complex. They're generally not very simple. So if it's not possible, so it's usually not possible to address all of the causes in a single advocacy campaign. So that is why you need to be able to take a look at what you've come up with once you've gone through that problem solution analysis and decide which ones that you will focus on in terms of your campaign. Right. So when you go about choosing your advocacy strategy, you also need to be able to identify which specific causes that you are going to address, why you're going to address them. Now, bear in mind that the strength of your organization will be a determining factor as well. And we went through a set of issues related to the strength of the organization, including staffing and the availability of resources, which could be financial, human, technological, knowledge base, etc. So there are a number of issues, or rather the number of issues that you would choose will be dependent on the size and capacity of your office, the types of issues to be addressed, as well as the environment which the organization operates in. So if I can get you to, okay, great. Sorry, I was getting some feedback, so I needed to mute a particular mic. So one of the things that you need to be able to do when you're setting your, developing your advocacy strategy is to come up with your goal and your objectives. And note I didn't say your goals, but your goal. It's usually, one goal is usually a very overarching, very easy to achieve, or yeah, a goal that is easy for, well, not, when I say easy, it doesn't mean that you don't have to do work, but relatively easy for the organization to achieve. So once you develop your advocacy goal, sorry, my tongue is just getting tied up here, it builds on the issue that you would have identified. It identifies how the policy change is going to be made. And it also takes a look at, examines how it would be achieved. So your goal should really state what policy your organization and partners want to have change, by how much, and by when, and also takes a look at who it's likely to make the change. So those are all things that you need to be thinking about when you're crafting your advocacy goals. As I said, there's only one. It's usually tied to the problem or the issue that you're seeking to address. It is kind of a broader long-term vision for change that a campaign is going to be addressing. It should be written in very clear, concise language that everybody can understand. And also, it should also refer to any benefits that will be offered to those who are affected by the issue. So some key questions that you should be asking is, how will we know if the policy has been successful? What would the policy actually start to look like? And this is your advocacy policy for which you're developing the strategy around. How would you, if a headline was supposed to be written, what would it actually look like in terms of the success of your advocacy policy, as well as who are those people? Are those people who are going to be affected by the issue? What is their expectation of what you're likely to be doing? So things like, how important is the goal to the people that your organization will be working with? So you'll be working not only with the target group, you're likely to be working with some strategic partners who will help you get implement your advocacy strategy. You may be working with decision makers. So how important is this issue or the goal that you have now defined? How important is that to all of these people? Another question is, how feasible and how achievable is the solution to the goal? Do people have the power to make the change? So that only that applies to your decision makers or the people who you've identified as influencers or decision makers. Do they have the power to make the change? Are the target your target, are they willing and empowered to make the change? Is there a process where key decisions could be made? So what are the process for decision making in the government or in the organization or institution that you are targeting? And then timing, is it the right time? Is the country at the point in time that you're looking to be launching your advocacy strategy and implementing your advocacy strategy? Is there general elections going on and everybody's focused on something else and nobody is going to be making any major decisions at that point in time? So it is important to be able to also get the timing as right as possible. And this means that you have to have an understanding of cycles that occur within the country as well, budgetary cycles, policy cycles, etc. Is it possible for you to actually implement what it is that you're thinking of doing? And this has implications for how you set your objectives as well. And we will get to that shortly. So how sellable is the idea? How sellable is the concept that you're developing? How are you going to be communicating this particular issue? What kind of, who can you influence in terms of getting them to be part and parcel or buy into the solution that you're coming up with? And then what evidence do you need to collect in order to add that punch to your strategy? Because everybody's going to be asking, one, how much is it going to cost? How many people are going to be impacted? And you need to be able to have these answers at the tip of your fingers or at the tip of your tongue. And what is the added value? After you have gone through the solution, you've identified the problem, you've gone through the solution, what's the added value? Once you've implemented it, what's the added value to your organization, to your target audience? At the national level, what's the added value? What's the added value at the international level? If your issue is one that has a global, there's a global issue and there are several countries also trying to tackle this particular issue. And then of course, what's the organizational fit? Does this goal fit within your CSO's overall vision and mission and your mandate? So all of that is very, very important. It's, even though we're using different language, it's almost as if the same kind of thinking when you're developing a business. Your actions, your plans, your strategies have to fit within the overall vision and direction of the company. The same thing with your developing your advocacy strategies. are the issues that you're tackling fitting within the overall organizational mandate? So next we'll take a look at your advocacy, your objectives. And what these are incremental, they're achievable steps. And achievable meaning is very, very important. When you set your objectives, you have to set objectives that you can achieve in the time frame that you're given. They describe the changes that will occur. And on Tuesday, we went through some of the different types of changes, behavioral changes, institutional changes, etc. It starts to articulate those. Well, you start to articulate those in your objectives, and then your actions associated with those objectives will give a clear idea of your roadmap for achievement. It's pretty much like how you write a project proposal for grant funding. You have to look at your objectives. They have to be, they have to be smart, etc. So another question you have to ask: you can have more than one objective in order to reach your goal, as you will have several activities under one objective to reach that overall goal. But the thing is that you need to be careful or guard against, having 10 objectives. It is better to have a limited amount of objectives that you can work through, because once you start to really work it through, you'll realize that for each objective, you can have several activities. So if you can take one and say you had one objective and you had at least 6 activities, and if you had 10 objectives, you can multiply that. You want to be able to have your objectives achievable and achievable in a specific time frame. I mean, there will be cases where you have long-term objectives, but at least be able to have those intermediate objectives where you can see results as well. And that is also very good when it comes to monitoring and evaluation. So we all hear about, the SMART objectives, which means that your objectives must be specific in that they describe a precise and detailed, they precisely detail exactly what it is that you're doing. How are they going to be measured? Again, this helps with evaluation. Are they achievable? Can you actually accomplish this with the resources that you have and within the time frame that you have indicated? Is it, are they realistic? Is it sensible? Is it practical to try to achieve these objectives? And then, time bound. So they have to be achievable within a specific time frame.
Wendy, can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so this is really a really knowledgeable class. I want to really thank you for sharing this information.
Yes, go ahead.
I myself I'm going through quite a few advocacy campaigns through my CSO and through my youth arm in Jamaica. An advocacy campaign, in my opinion, posts a lot of different incremental parts in order for it to be successful. So as you mentioned earlier, there has to be a certain amount of value. It has to be feasible. You have to have the right people, the competent people, to reach your objectives, in order to achieve a successful advocacy campaign. But one thing I was wondering, that affects a lot of advocacy campaigns, including the ones that I'm involved with, is the lack of funding and resources. When you're advocating for something and you require a certain level or a certain amount of resources or funding, and you realize that you're unable to get that funding, and it is required in order for you to have a successful advocacy campaign, do you create an advocacy campaign for an advocacy campaign in order to try and and pull the funds together? How would you how would you react in a scenario like that?
Okay. You've actually raised a very good point, and we're actually going to be talking about that. Not too sure if we'll reach it today or if we'll reach it, get to that point next week. But your resources are very, very important, and you really do need to be very creative in how you come up with those resources. So it's very interesting that you said, do you have to have an advocacy campaign for your advocacy campaign in order to raise the funds? But I would say you probably meant, or I wouldn't presume to say what you meant, but it might be more a question of what's your strategy for raising funds? Or I should say, what's your strategy for ensuring that you have the resources that you require in order to implement your advocacy strategy or your advocacy campaign? And you'll see as we go through that we talk about identifying those stakeholders, and those stakeholders also include your donors. So you will definitely have to be writing a number of project proposals. You need to be going out to people who can sponsor your cause. And that is why it's so important, when I mentioned before that area where you're identifying the problem and the root causes, the research that you do should really start to yield the people who you can strategically position yourself with, because you're not operating in a vacuum. So there are likely to be agencies nationally or regionally or even internationally that are tackling the same issues that you're tackling. And so you may find that by forming the partnerships, that there's certain things that you don't need to do because your partner is already doing it. And so you just need to align your objectives so that when they accomplish their objective, that you've accomplished that objective as well. So I think it's a case of being extremely creative and determine how do you actually get to those funds. And like I said, we're going to cover that shortly. But if maybe someone else can, to just give their personal experience and how they've gone about the whole process of raising funds, or what are some of the challenges they've encountered, and what has worked for them, lessons learned in terms of identifying the funding to run a campaign. Anybody else wants to weigh in on that? Or do you want to wait until we actually cover that section? So was it Kendra that asked the question? Did I cover what you, did I address the question, your query satisfactorily?
Yes,
Okay.
You did perfectly, Wendy. Thank you.
Okay. Like I said, we will also be getting to that either today or next week.
Okay.
Let me try to take us back. Okay, so the other thing that you would probably want to include as well in your advocacy strategy is, maybe a vision or a mission statement. Not all advocacy strategies have them, but I thought I'll just throw that in there to say that if you can also include that when you're developing your advocacy strategy. Excuse me. So one other thing that is going to be very, very important in developing that advocacy strategy is your stakeholder mapping. This is where you now begin to understand your stakeholders, what role that they play, and how effective they will be, or rather, how you can pull them in so that you can effectively effect the change that you are looking for. So your focus would be on mapping your stakeholders' interests, their influence, and their importance, as well as knowing what's the power, what's their relative power. Because sometimes to reach, decision makers, you may not have direct access. So you may need to know who is it that actually influences the decision makers. Okay, and very often, sometimes we think in terms of institutions. That is always a good start. So this is the institution that we need to touch or liaise with to help us in developing our advocacy strategy and implementing it. But it's very, very important for each institution to be able to know who you have to get in touch with in that organization to make it happen. And sometimes it may not be, yes, you may need to liaise with the obvious, the person who is titled, but it's also good to know who are the ones who actually do the work within the organizations. If it is information that you want, or, because they can also guide you as to how to plan the best strategy to approach that particular decision maker that you are trying to tap into. And then you also need to be able to map your targets. You need to know who your target audience is, who's in that community, who's influential in that community, how big is the community, how are you actually going to, this mapping actually guides you as to how best you can tap into the resources that are available to help with the implementation of the strategy. So what we're after here is to develop that network of stakeholders, that network of partnerships that will be critical for you to implement. So your network would be that group of people or organizations that can share information, opportunities, skills, resources, and this includes funding, to help you to build that collective power that you would need to be in order to successfully implement your strategy. And here we're thinking in terms of who, it may be a policy change that you're after. So what is that policy change and how can you make that change happen?
You see the mapping, are you able to
right. So your stakeholders, you have what you would consider your primary stakeholders or your primary targets and your secondary targets. So your primary targets are those who have that power to make the changes that are required. So it is that the decision maker who influence the legislation or influence a standard that you might want implemented. So those are the people who are your primary targets, and they are people. They may be in institutions, but those are the people that you need to be targeted. So let's take a closer look. And your secondary targets, as I mentioned before, that sometimes in order to get to your primary target, it may be difficult for whatever reason. So you may want to have a strategy of how you can reach them in an indirect way, but not too indirect, by those people who have influence on your primary target. And those are who you consider your secondary target. So your secondary targets can be, categorized in 3 types. You have your influencers, you have your allies, and you have your opponents. And let's sort of go through them as we go along. So okay, I think my slides probably got a little bit out of sequence here, but oh yeah, no, it's okay. So your influencers, those are the ones with whom the primary targets are accountable. So these, you're thinking now in terms of people who can hold the decision makers accountable. So you have like your advisors, if they're advisors, your local government counselors, your public opinion. In this case, you're thinking in terms of voters, personal contacts in academia. And I have a list here, but this list is by no means exhaustive. So your allies, these are the ones who share your goals and who have some power to influence your targets. So you're looking then for those stakeholders that are, as we say, on the same page. So you're moving towards the same goal. You may be taking a different angle or a different approach, but ultimately you're looking to have the same impact on the community or impact on your target as you are. It's just that you may be tackling, they may be tackling it, they may have identified a different problem and solution to the ones that you have identified, but you're both heading down the same road. Again, we're looking at coalitions or networks of people who you can galvanize in order to support the cause that you're having. Now your opponents, these are very interesting because those are the ones who stand to lose by whatever it is that you're looking to implement. So as the example that I gave before, obviously looking at having access to essential medicines and being able to have more available generic medicines, your opponents will be the ones who hold the monopoly on the production at that point in time, the ones who own the patents, the pharmaceutical companies, etc. So, but you still need to consider them. You don't waste a whole lot of time in terms of your strategy. So you don't necessarily develop a strategy. Your advocacy strategy will not be targeting them as the main focal point, but certainly you need to be able to know what is happening there and then how you may be able to turn them into your allies. Okay, so they're the ones who may have the power to stop you from achieving your objectives. So you have to take time to understand them, know what the arguments are likely to be so you can come up with counter arguments. So you do need to have a pretty good idea of those who are likely to oppose your the particular solution that you're looking to implement. Sometimes, you may not find any strong opposition to what you're doing because it is recognized as a fundamental human need that you are addressing. So some of the questions then that you would ask in terms of your stakeholders and your stakeholder mapping would be things like who is likely to gain from the proposed changes, who might be adversely affected, and very important, who has the power to make the changes happen. What kind of complaints are there around the issue? What are the vulnerable groups? What this does is it starts for you, if you go through this and you come up with a list, even if you just came up with a list of 3 persons, 5 persons, each of these questions, you can see where your list begins to grow. And then these are the people that you need to categorize and determine how you're going to target them. And when we go through the communication strategies, then you need to identify how you're going to craft your messages to these different categories of targets, of stakeholders. So you also need to take a look at the assessment of the stakeholders' interests. What are their interests? What are their expectations? So when you start to introduce your problem and your solution and you come in with your evidence that you have gathered, what is the expectations are they likely to have in relation to what it is that you're doing? How are they going to benefit? And then, do they have any resources that you can tap into that they're willing to mobilize? Okay, and remember that your resources are not always financial resources. Do they have the human resources that can help you? Do they have knowledge that they can bring to bear in your particular, for your particular cause? Then you need to also know what interests that they have that will conflict with the goals that you have set, or with your goal that you have set, and your objectives and your actions that you would have come up with. And again, you need to, what kind of support and opposition are you likely to have? Does the stakeholders publicly support or oppose the issue? Who are they? What have they done so far on this particular issue? Who are they allied with? Who are their partners? And can you also tap into their partnership base to build your network as well? What kind of influence do they have? Is it political influence that they have? What about their social and economic power of your particular stakeholders, of the targets that you are, of the stakeholders that you're targeting? How well are they organized? Because if they have a very good organizational structure, are they well organized in terms of the community, then it makes your job that much easier when you go in to talk about the issue that you have identified and how you want to address it and how you want to work with them in order to come up with that, to implement that solution. What control do they have over their own resources? And then what kind of, not only their formal influences, but what about the informal influences as well? At what level is that influence, and how can you tap into it so it's beneficial to your movement? And then you also need to do an assessment of the stakeholder importance. How does the stakeholder have a right to the solutions for the issue? Because sometimes when you are looking to implement, and this is very general, sometimes when you're looking to implement a solution, it may, for example, if it's an issue of indigenous land rights, for example, then you need to be able to understand the dynamics that are happening there. So another question you can ask yourself is, will engaging stakeholders help to address the deeper underlying causes of the problem? Because that is going to be very, very important for sustainability of your implemented actions in the future. So once you've actually gone through that list of thinking, and really what we're trying to do here is to get you to really be questioning, asking questions, coming up with the answers, building that stakeholder base, because once you've developed that network, what you want to be happening there is, as important as it is to track, and you can begin to track the flow of financial resources and determine how you can tap into it. But also of equal importance, how are you tapping the flow of knowledge through this network to make it beneficial for your CSO and for the cause that you are actually backing. So again, once you go forward, when you're moving forward, and the next steps is to focus on your primary and secondary targets. Be aware of what your opponents are doing, what their strengths and weaknesses are. Don't spend too much time on them, because sometimes you can just get stuck in trying to just outwit your opponents, and you just end up wasting quite a lot of time there. Be aware that they're there, be aware of what is happening, have your counter arguments in place, and just move forward with your strategy. So again, your target must be specific. As I said before, while you may be approaching an institution, you need to be able to identify a person or persons within that institution who you be liaising with. As I said before as well, you need to be able to understand the institutional and decision-making process as it relates in general within the community, at the national level, etc., so that you can identify how change occurs within that process and how your actions that you plan for your advocacy strategy, how it fits within that process. So this is all about just being strategic. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know, but it's just sort of bringing it into a strategic focus. So once you have an understanding of your target audience, who your target is, who your stakeholder base are, then you can then decide exactly how you're going to start to approach them, so that you can get maximum effect. So the next step here is taking a look at your message. So you've identified who your stakeholders are. You identify your category of stakeholders and your targets. Now you need to determine how are you going to go about actually reaching those targets, and how you are actually going to craft your message to each particular target. And we know when we talk about communication, the language and the message is going to be different for your different stakeholders. You will not have the same message, or you will not take the same approach right across the board for everyone. That just spells failure. Okay, or at least it will be ineffective. You have to be able to understand each of those stakeholders that you identify, that you unearth, that are now part of your network. And you need to be able to understand the type of message, what it is that you want them to know, what it is that you want them to do, and how are you going to communicate this to them. So your advocacy messages will have two basic components. One, there's an appeal to what is just generally right. So it is right that we end domestic violence. It is right that we have access to medicines, affordable access to affordable medicines. But you also need to appeal to their self-interest. What is it that they'll be interested in? So when they join alliances with you, that they are also gaining. So you need to be able to find that and appeal to that as well. So what is it that will motivate each target audience that you have? So that then you can start to, because remember that your message to them is going to be evidence-based. It has to be evidence-based. Because if you're approaching them for the first time, then they're going to know, well, okay, well, this is a very interesting topic. It's a very interesting problem that you've identified, and an even more interesting and creative solution. But where's the evidence? So you need to be able to have that evidence base as well in your message, and be able to manipulate. When I say manipulate, I don't mean in a negative way, but be able to manipulate the data that you have and the information that you have, so that you can target it specifically for each of your target audience. So your message can be both primary and secondary messages. So your primary message, that is your most universal and compelling statement to all of your audiences. So even though, as I said, you're going to have a specific message or a specific tone of message and content for each of your categories of stakeholders, there still has to be consistency moving through all of your messages. And that's your primary message, consistently throughout all of the messages to all of your target audiences. It has to be clear, it must be concise, it has to be compelling, direct, and very simple, very transparent, and understood at all levels. So when you're developing your message, your primary message, you're kind of, it has to have a statement, the evidence, throw in an example, your goal is tied in there somehow, and your desired action, what it is you want to happen, what it is that you want that particular audience, excuse me, to do in order to effect the change. So let me see if I have this broken down. Yes. So this is dealing with your primary message. So your statement, this is the central idea in the message. It is, you know, the analysis or the cause of the problem. It outlines why the change is important. Okay, so that's your statement. Then the evidence supports that statement. So you back it up with facts, figures, you know, being able to use that tailored language to communicate to that particular audience that you're targeting. So your example adds the human face when communicating the message. So you can use an example from the community, you can use an example surrounding the particular issue that you have. Your goal is really what you want to achieve, the results of the desired action. And then the desired action is what you want. Sorry, that should be what you want to do. I'll correct that typo before I send it out to you. So it's what you want to do in support of reaching your defined objectives that you have. So that's the core of your advocacy messaging as well. As it tends to distinguish, and this is what distinguishes your primary messaging and your advocacy messaging from just straight other types of communication, where you may just want to inform somebody of something. You know, this is what those 5 elements: the statement, evidence, throwing in your example, the goal, and your desired action. That kind of sets it apart from just straight communication. So your secondary message is tailored for a particular target audience. It provides further explanation of the key areas or concepts that you would have identified that were salient in your primary message. And it's often used when a particular audience needs a primary message to be reinforced. So what it does, it explains how the objectives of the primary message will be met. It speaks to the action that should be taken. So the particular audience, what it is that you want them to do, is you're appealing to them in order for them to effect change that you have identified. So what is it that you want them to do? And you often tend to have several secondary messages that are tailored to specific needs of your particular audience. So I think I'll pause at this time, and you know, if there are any questions. I know we're going through this at a very tight clip, but over the weekend I will post a discussion question as well as post your worksheets for this. Because what I want to be able for you to be able to do is to start thinking in terms of your advocacy strategy that you need to present at the end of the course. And so you have a little bit more guidance in what we're looking for in putting that together. So do I have any questions?
Question.
Yes?
Based on your networking, especially your political strategy, based on your based on your system that is in your country, right? Democracy, you have a democratic, and based on your political status or stand, how do you approach a company or that you want to network in? Should their political status differ 2 years, and they could be a good person that you can network with? How can you walk around that so at least that aspect stay neutral?
Okay, you mean in terms of being able to, if your target or,
Yes.
or if they happen to be political?
Yes, based on the
Okay, can you repeat the question, because I wasn't getting everything coming through clearly.
Yes. I was asking again, we know sometimes some things are, as I say, politically influenced by certain situations that make arise, especially in the campaigning and, you know, advocacy and stuff. So if you know that person that they network and they does a lot for community, for whatever cause, and sometimes to avoid the clashes of political status, as I say, if they're not in same light with what your goals are, based on your political status. I just want to know, how can you walk around that so that your political status does not have any negative influence then in losing that person as.
When you say your political influence, you mean the person you're targeting, or you mean the organization?
Well, but it's both sides. You as someone, as is, you don't let that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would say that when you are, as a CSO, developing an advocacy strategy, you almost need to be apolitical. So try to be, and this is something that we have heard on Tuesday, in terms of the organization, try to be as neutral as possible.
Right.
That is, in terms of the organization. In terms of your cause, they'll sometimes have, how would I put it? You may, because you're looking to make a policy change,
yes,
or you may be looking to make a change in legislation, then you have to interact. And I say politically, and I put that in quotes. The thing is to get as much emotion out of the way as possible. So these are the facts. So that's why you need your evidence. These are your facts. And so you're basically presenting your cause based on the facts that you have, the problem that you've identified. It doesn't really matter in terms of, you're not playing a political game. What you are doing is that you've identified that this is a problem, this is a solution, and this is how you want it to be implemented. And so therefore, in choosing the stakeholders, that is why when you do your stakeholder mapping, you have to be you have to know what the interests are. And you basically need to be able to have all of your stakeholders working in such a way that your objectives are achieved. Now, I know I'm not answering your political question. I'm trying to get around it, but by saying that as much as possible, try to be not political in your approach, but being able to use the decision-making process in the country in order to effect that change. Because what you don't want to be seen as an organization that is against a particular political position or against a particular elected officials or for particular elected officials, because that's going to come back to bite you when, in terms of the operations of the organization.
Okay.
All right. I'm not too sure if I answered your question, but I'm basically trying to say let the facts speak for themselves.
Okay.
Make sure that the cause that you are forwarding is one that is not based on politics, and also make sure that in garnering support and including stakeholders, it is not,
Right.
someone doesn't run away with it and twist it into a very political angle.
Right. That is the point I was trying to raise. Sometimes that's not your intention, but based on their political status, they may take all of that and turn it so then look as though you are, that's not your initial intention, as much as you want, as the not being politically biased in any sense, because you don't want that campaign to be based on that, even though you have your goals set and there is a potential person that you can work with. It's just that when those things, the red flags then show up, how do you walk around it?
Exactly. This may be a case where you may not work with them directly, but you work with someone who has influence, who can influence them. So you still get to that particular decision maker, but in indirect way, so that you're not kind of tarnished with their political affiliations and political agendas.
Right.
So that is why it is a strategy. I don't want to say it's a battle strategy, but when you start to map your stakeholders, you begin to see a picture emerging on how you can basically align with certain stakeholders in order to get what you want done, but still appearing to be very neutral.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Not a problem. Any more questions?
That's it for me.
All right. So I think we've done our hour. So I will break here. And next week, what we'll do is we'll cover communications. We'll look at monitoring and evaluation. Oh yeah, we'll look at communications, resources, monitoring and evaluation. Yeah, I think that's it. Just taking a look at, your roadmap and monitoring and evaluation.
Thank you a lot, Wendy.
Okay, so if there aren't any more questions, thank you very much for spending your Friday evening with me. I hope you enjoyed it.
I did. I personally really did enjoy this class. It was really knowledgeable.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, so everybody have a very splendid weekend.
You as well.
Thanks, and same to
Okay,
you.
and I promise I won't. I would submit my the worksheets and stuff like that on Sunday, so at least you have tomorrow to relax.
Perfect.
So I'll post them up on Sunday for you.
Okay.
Great.
All right. Thanks again, Wendy. Good night, guys.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Everybody. Bye.